things. But hey, thanks for joining me today to talk about remote teaching in our pandemic world. My name is Wanzer-Serrano. I am currently an associate professor at the University of Iowa, although I will soon, July 1st, be making my way down to Texas A&M University in College Station. I want to start by just talking a little bit about who I am and why I'm doing this Facebook Live event and what I plan to do in the coming weeks to kind of finish off this kind of unit on remote teaching. So I should start by saying, I am not an expert in online teaching at all. I think that's the boat that a lot of us are in, although I know there are a lot of online teachers out there who do an excellent job and have quite a bit of training in doing that successfully. I am not that person. I am a person who is kind of thrown into teaching online, teaching remotely because of the global pandemic, right? But what I also am is a person who has done so in a way that I'm actually, despite being a skeptic about this stuff, despite being someone who, by training and by nature prefers face-to-face teaching, face-to-face learning, I've become a bit of a convert, at least in the sense that I've come to a point where I see how it can work. And I want to share some of my experiences with you because I have the feeling that there's a lot of people like me out there, people who are diehard, teaching, learning has to be face-to-face. There's no way to do it otherwise. Anything else is just a stopgap. And, maybe it is a stopgap for a lot of us, but it's one that we're going to have to be dealing with for probably at least another year, right? And so that being the case, we might as well take this as an opportunity to learn and to grow and to be able to practice our craft and what we're passionate about in a way that is as productive for our students and ourselves as possible. So that's what I'm here to talk about today and over the coming weeks. I think part of what leads me to believe I have something to say about this is that over the course of the last couple of months of the spring semester, I took a course that that prior to that semester had really been frankly derided by students, one that people really did not look forward to taking. Made some significant revisions with the help of the guests that you're going to see in just a few minutes, and created an in-person class that I was actually becoming pretty happy with, in part because I liked to teach it more, but also because I think the students like to be in the room a lot more. And moving from that to the online environment, what I saw was sure, there was less student engagement in some ways. Students started following their own kinds of schedules, but learning didn't stop. In fact, learning continued in basically the same pace that it had been since the beginning of the semester. And I think that's because of some of the things that I'm going to talk about today and over the course of this series. So here's what I plan to do over the next few weeks. I think that this series is really about setting yourself up for success if and when you have to teach remotely again. Now, I don't know about you, but I know for me, it's a pretty high likelihood that I'm going to be teaching all of my courses remotely in the fall, and I think a decent probability that I'm going to be teaching them in the spring. And I think even if you're at an institution that's saying, oh, everything's going to be in person, how many of us are really going to put money on that, right? Maybe the first day will be in person, right? But is it really going to continue in person all semester long? I'm not going to bet very much on that. I don't think you would either. And so I think you want to set your class up in such a way that even if you're starting out the semester teaching in person, face to face, you want to be able to make that pivot as quickly and easily as possible when the time comes, right? Not if the time comes, but when the time comes. And so this series is about setting you up for success in doing that. Another purpose of the series is to, I think, quell and address some of the misconceptions some of us have about teaching remotely that are, frankly, oftentimes rooted in kind of weird and problematic notions of rigor, right? I know that one of the things that I've heard colleagues talk about over the years is they're really opposed to online classes because they're easy and because students don't get a lot out of them. And they're really kind of in general preoccupied with having these super rigorous classes, right? Whatever that means. And I know I was one of those people too. So, I'm sure that I said it over the years that I wanted to have, a rigorous, challenging course for my students. And to a certain extent, I still believe that, right? I still believe that students should be challenged, and challenging courses are a good thing because they get people to really kind of address either, misconceptions that they have, preconceived notions about a topic, or really kind of come to terms with how little they might have known about a topic and then move forward with new understanding, right? And come to kind of like learn about the learning process along the way. And I think you can do all of that without being a jerk. And you can do all of that in ways that really better support student learning with things that might on face seem like easy assignments, but really at the end of the day are things that fundamentally help students build up their kind of knowledge and work through a learning process that takes them from those kind of basic levels of understanding to higher order levels of thinking. So while in future episodes, I'm going to get into the weeds in terms of what technology I use and how I structure my assignments, in this episode, what I want to do is kind of take us back to basics. So today I want to talk about a little bit about how to design your course from the ground up for in-person or online, because the principles ultimately are the same in either of those contexts. I want to talk about how you craft good learning objectives, and I really, really want to talk about how you align your course, right, including readings, formative assessments, and major assessments with your course objectives, right? Because at the end of the day, and this is something that I think I would have said that I knew, but didn't really appreciate or understand in any kind of full sense, not that I understand it fully now, is that if you're not keeping those well-crafted learning objectives, kind of building those up as a strong foundation for your course, the rest of the stuff, if it works, it's kind of working by accident, right? You really have to keep those objectives in mind, centrally focused for you as you're building the rest of the parts of your course. And if you do that, it's easy to make those pivots as learning environments change, and it's easy to be able to adjust to better suit the needs of the students that you have in front of you. So that's the plan of what we're going to do today. Before I bring in my guests, I want to talk a little bit about the background of my experience over the course of the last year, because I think it's important for how we get to where I am today. So let me see. I'm working on this technology. I already did the overview of the series in today. So the second thing, so where I'm coming from here is starting with what was at the end of the day a problematic course being taught in my department. This was one of only a couple of required courses, a large lecture format course that was required, as I mentioned, and had very few changes in it over the course of many years. And even when one of the big kind of structural problems of the course was addressed, which was the fact that a semester-long course was split in half between a social scientist and me, a humanist, who would swap Z at the middle of the semester and teach and go teach another group of students. Once we solved that and each took a semester-long class, there were still problems with the course that I think were being unaddressed. And these problems manifest themselves in low student engagement. I mean, honestly, after a week or so, 2/3 of the students would quit attending lecture, which was really hard to deal with. Students weren't satisfied with the course, right? Not that making students happy is necessarily the thing that we all have to be preoccupied with, because learning is hard and people are unhappy with that sometimes. But they were so dissatisfied with the course that I think it got in the way of learning. There was low retention of information. There was poor performance on the assessments. And so I know that I really needed and wanted to deal with that. And that's when this kind of course, my spelling is wrong, the course collaboratory fellowship program came into my view at Iowa. This is a program that is really designed to help people rethink teaching and learning in kind of fundamental ways. And what it did was it brought to me a group of professionals who are experts in learning design, in data analysis, and also other teachers who were going through the same process, all in a setting that's really geared toward rethinking and reevaluating a course, right, and then piloting a new version of it that hopefully shows some improvements. And so I met regularly with the folks that you'll meet today in just a little bit. Had group meetings with other professors who were trying to revamp their large and small courses. And what resulted from that was that's a process that started last summer, probably around this time. And what resulted from that was in the spring semester, a course that really, I had to make very few changes in the lectures, and I'll get to that on another day. I had to make few changes to the size and scope of the major assessments, but I engaged in really a kind of what I think of as a thorough rethinking and revamping of the pacing, of the justification, and of the instruction for major assessments and their scaffolding. And so, looking at the syllabus, you may not see huge changes between spring 2019 and spring 2020 in this course, but the changes were much more significant and felt more significant to the students. And thankfully, even though I'm a humanist, I love that we have the data to back it up, right? Not only were student grades better, but student satisfaction was better, student engagement was better, attendance was better. Every metric that we had to evaluate, both from my end seeing it and from people behind the scenes looking at the data of how people were engaging the materials in our Canvas site and elsewhere, it was, in a lot of ways, it was night and day. And it definitely felt that way to me. And so the biggest lesson I learned this last year was that learning has to be scaffolded in a purposeful and intentional way. And that means that you have to figure out what your long-term learning outcomes are that you're working toward, what your short-term learning objectives are for the course that you're teaching, and how you can operationalize and work toward those objectives on a weekly basis. And so everything that you do in your course, right, needs to align with your objectives for the course. And maybe that seems like an obvious thing to say, and I think it's something that all teachers kind of know. But what I love about the process in the course collaboratory and working with Shelby and Pinar, who I'm going to get to in just a moment, is that they really had a process for helping you focus in on clarifying what those learning objectives are and making sure that they align with every single thing that you do in the class. And when you do that, it really helps you to see, okay, is this thing that I was committed to for some reason really necessary, or is it just kind of extraneous and getting in the way, right? And that helps to, at the very least, helps to trim the fat from a course, to really focus in on what matters. And I think, in a bigger sense, really helps to kind of reorient how you see all the parts of your course fitting together. And, honestly, there is no way I can design a new course again without going through this process, right? Knowing how it works and knowing how valuable it is for both myself and for my students. It's my new teaching religion, and so I'm here to proselytize with. I'm not going to carry this religious metaphor out, but I'm here to kind of work with to work with the people who worked with me to help you learn as well, and so part of this also is realizing that rather than relying solely on high stakes assessments like tests and formal papers, which are important, but which are definitely still important, you need to scaffold those things with supporting and low stakes assessments, formative assessments, right? That give students the opportunities to learn and to get things wrong, and practice gives them practice at enacting the habits of mind and writing, in my case, that you're working toward. Right. And so all of that also meant really building things within kind of Bloom's taxonomy and being intentional about how you're moving from those lower level forms of learning and critical thinking to those higher level forms. Right. And so that brings me to my guest here today. So welcome. I'm joined by Pinar Celik, who's a learning designer at the University of Iowa, and Shelby Herig, who's also a learning designer at the University of Iowa. These were the folks that I met with like all the time. Say hi.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So, like I said, these are the members of the learning design team from the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Technology at the University of Iowa. I brought them in because, first of all, they're awesome and super knowledgeable, and because they really changed how I think about course design. And I have to say, as a graduate student, we took pedagogy pretty seriously. All graduate students in my program had to take at least one pedagogy course. I also participated in something called Preparing Future Faculty, which took me on a site visit at another university across the country. And it's, despite all of that, and despite the kind of like scratching the surface that I did in those settings, I realized I don't know that I learned all that much about learning design and course design, at least not in a kind of like evidence-based sort of way. And so I want them to come in and talk about the kind of like cornerstone of the process that I went through with them, which is called the alignment exercise. And so I guess I'll just start by asking, what is a course alignment? Or if you want to start somewhere else, you can start somewhere else.
First of all, I think we would both like to thank you, Daryl, for the wonderful introduction and even the background. When we talk about course design, it's really a specific process that we like to take with each of the faculty that we work with. But at large, there's some particular skills and ideas that everybody can walk away with. You just have to realize that it's going to be specific to your course. And so what might look similar for maybe Daryl's course and another related course, it's not even going to be identical. It might be related, but then if we have somebody from a mathematics course come in, it's going to be completely different. And so we can take some broad strokes and, as Daryl just said, talk about some of the cornerstones, but it's developing some of the skills that you'll be able to attune specifically to each of the courses that you're working on. Pinar, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, not to that, but perhaps we can move forward with the process, instructional design process that we follow. Yeah. It's called AD model. I'm going to drop the jargon. Just to unpack it, perhaps it entitles analysis, design, development, and evaluation, implementation and evaluation. So these things, I think Daryl is sharing the screen right now with the model. Yep. So like Shelby was mentioning, we start with the analysis portion, and we analyze the needs of the course, needs of the learners, which will be unique for every single course and every single occasion, and identify the course design goals specific for that particular course. For instance, for Daryl's course, one of the things that we wanted to change or achieve, get better at doing was increasing student engagement with the readings. So students were not actually participating, doing the readings and coming to class prepared. So once we identify that, and we start the process of design. And this is exactly where the alignment exercise come in. And we coined the term. It's not a rocket science. What we do in that alignment exercise is apply the backward design principles, which starts with really explicitly spelling out your learning outcomes, learning objectives, and dividing the course into learning modules that will create a theme for your students. And this would give a nice scaffolding for you, your TAs, and for your students as well.
I'm going to share that here. I'm sharing the screen with the alignment exercise now. If you want to walk through any of that.
Yeah, Shelby.
So as Pinar was just mentioning, we kind of break it up using the backwards design, starting with the big picture idea. And when we're talking about the outcomes, we're talking about how does your course among many courses contribute to a change in a student over the course of time. So it's not something that we would see progress within one semester or maybe even 2 semesters, but it's during their course or their sequence of courses throughout a duration of time. So if we're trying to get students to become particular scholars that are able to demonstrate particular skills or provide particular insights or information, we have to look at it as, is this something I expect students do not have at the beginning of the semester and something they will have at the end? Or is this just one stepping stone towards a larger idea that we're trying to get students to accomplish? So if we're looking at it as that stepping stone, that's the outcome. We're hoping to figure out why this course is within a sequence of other courses. What's the importance of it? Why is it relevant? Why are we having this as a prereq course or an elective course? Where does it fit among aiding students to better themselves, both in knowledge and skill and ability? When we're looking at the objectives, we're looking a little bit more specifically toward your course in particular. And we're saying, on day 1, we expect most students will not have this skill or this knowledge, or if they do, it's probably not very refined. And so our purpose for having students take this course is to be able to practice and refine that skill or knowledge. So by the end of the semester, they'll be more expert in that particular domain. And so that's really where we spend a lot of time, and we will go back and forth multiple iterations with many faculty. Luckily, Daryl got it pretty much first time around, but this is a very reciprocal process normally.
I did not get it first time around. In fact, I remember vividly at one point, I was so kind of like lost and overwhelmed by the process. I was just like, I'm stuck. I can't move forward. And I know there was like, I think I canceled one meeting. I tried to avoid the problem. I canceled a meeting, and then I came back and was like, okay, wait, we need to go back a step. I need your help on this. And I can actually show what one version of this looks like. So this is how mine kind of got filled out. Where I've got the kind of like bigger learning outcomes here in the first column, which have a lot of notes attached to them too, and then the specific learning objectives here in the second column, and then if I scroll down, I can show you here. There's a table that we filled out that had every topic. Think of every week of the semester, every topic, and then how that lines up with X's here with each of the each of the objectives for the course. So I'll turn things back over to you too.
No, that's great to see an example. So what Daryl was just showing you as his example of walking through this is the objectives are the part that are trickiest for many of us. Even if we're really familiar with teaching and learning in general, it's something that we don't take a keen eye to very often. And so reorienting ourselves, we're taking a look at what explicitly in in measurable items am I asking students to be able to do in a particular course? And so that's where Daryl had mentioned earlier, Bloom's taxonomy. That's where we really heavily emphasize Bloom's taxonomy is not only are we looking to see both lower and higher order thinking skills here, but are these skills that are realistic for the student population we're looking at? So if we're looking at an introductory course, are you going to be having them do a lot of evaluation and analysis right off the bat, or do we need to build some of those lower order thinking skills where they're able to foundationally understand a concept and then be able to manipulate that concept in some way and then be able to then do some kind of analysis or evaluation of that? So kind of building it in, that's where the learning activities come into play, which we'll get to a little bit later. But for the objectives themselves is, okay, you have a general idea of what you want students to be able to do in your course, but how can you make that as explicit and measurable as possible? So I, as a student, can look at your objectives and say, you expect me throughout the duration of this course to be able to analyze particular things or compute different ideas or whatever the objectives end up being. I know exactly what it is that you're expecting of me.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that, like, I think prior to this last semester, I'd always put my objectives at the front of the syllabus, and they just kind of be there. And I would rarely, and maybe this is just me being bad, but I would rarely explicitly reference them right over the course of the semester after that. And so really by focusing things on and tying it to the specific things that we're doing with students and telling them and like making those connections more transparent to them, it made a huge difference. And having that kind of taxonomy in mind, I can put that back on the screen. Yeah, you mentioned introductory level class and really building from the bottom to the top. I know I used to have an assignment on the syllabus that really asked people to be reflecting in a way that I had no business expecting them to be able to do in an introductory course, right? That's not the point of the course. That really wasn't one of my objectives when I really sat down to think about it. And when I changed that assignment and got rid of that component, it went from being one of the least favorite assignments in the class to the favorite assignment. Like people in the course evals at the end of the semester were like, I loved this assignment. This was a lot of fun. I learned a lot from it. And that's purely a product of this process and really kind of like reorganizing expectations and really thinking in terms of how we can operationalize these different levels of learning.
Yep, you said it, Daryl. I think one example, like we are talking about this entire thing as conceptual thing right now. One example that we provide to our faculty when we work with them is, think about yourself learning a language. What would be your learning outcome in this case? In 5 years, I'm going to move to Japan and start living, earning a living there, and just maybe be there for the next 10 years. What do I need for that? Those answers, your answers to that particular question will be your learning outcomes. So in 5 years, you would be fluent in Japanese, and you will be able to communicate maybe in a business environment in Japan. So if these are your two learning outcomes, when it comes to an entry-level course in a Japanese program, what would you do in order to help your students? Would you start with grammar? Would you start with cultural experiences, like giving those bits and pieces to your students? Those will be your learning objectives. And then in the second course or the second year, you will be building on top of them, but still your learning outcomes will be same for 5 to 10 years. You are working towards that learning outcome. Again, I know it's easier, and whenever we sit and talk about it, it sounds easy to do, but there's no need to sugarcoat. It's a very frustrating process. It's pretty demanding, but once you actually invest time into really figuring out this alignment between your learning outcomes and objectives, then later on conceptualizing your assessments and learning activities in the course, the rest of the process will take no time. And whenever you need to bounce back and forth between different learning environments, you will be able to go back and then see, okay, this was my learning objectives originally. How can I make this work in this blended learning environment? How can I make this work in this online environment?
Yeah.
Then you at least reduce the question into that one single thing. Maybe you just need to figure out what instructional technology to use or whom to ask.
Yeah. And that's the two things that you said just then were so true in my experience. One is that once you figure out the outcomes and the objectives and really formulate good objectives, everything else kind of comes easier from that point on. It just kind of actually going through and figuring out how to revise the major assessments. It just became so clear, so apparent to me. It's like, okay, well, clearly I need to do these things, and that's going to be, can just kind of knock that out. And then the other thing that you said in terms of making that shift from in-person to online, once we got to that point, I wasn't too stressed about it. And I felt a little weird that I wasn't too stressed about it. And I think you all thought I was a little weird for not being too stressed about it. But it all just made so much sense to me. It's like, well, the learning objectives are all the same, right? And now I just got to make some decisions about what to get rid of. And I, of course, reached out to you all like, hey, should I cut this much or this much? And you were kind and help me cut a little bit more out and realign some assignments. Like, okay, well, if we can't do this, if it doesn't make sense to do this assignment anymore, what learning objectives was it addressing, and how can I address that with something that is better suited to online learning? And then it just kind of it kind of resolves itself in some ways.
Daryl said something really important there too, and I think it comes back to another basic question that I know he loved hearing from us was why? What is the purpose? So when you're thinking through ideas of, well, we've always just written this paper in this course, or I inherited this course and it has this paper in it. Our question to you is, but why? What is the purpose of including that paper in that course? What objective is it meeting? Is this a course that has to do with math? And so writing an essay might not be the best way because it's not really hitting the skills or knowledge that we're looking at, but maybe having them do maybe a presentation would be better. We figure out what is the best suited learning activity, whether that be some kind of an assessment, an assignment, maybe it's a group discussion. We figure out those elements when we're able to figure out why. Why are we looking to include this? So with what purpose? I think Daryl just beautifully demonstrated that of when he is transferring from the face-to-face to online, it became, okay, logistically, let's take a look at it and make sure that we can accommodate the learner's needs as well now in this environment. But why am I looking to include particular pieces was a question that we asked him, whether it was face-to-face or online. So when he came back and said, should I be cutting this or not? We're also asking him, why? Why are you considering cutting that? With what reason? And if we do cut that, what are the implications for it? So
yeah, but why? I loved the but why though, right? Because part of it was when you'd ask me but why, I'd be like, yeah, okay, this is obvious now. And and you're like, explain. I talk it out. You're like, yep. Hey, there's a question here online. I'm gonna get it up on the screen for everyone to see and read it to you as well. What do you think is a common mistake that folks make in crafting an objective? Do they tend to not be measurable enough, or something else? Great question, Julia.
Yeah, Julia, that's a great question. I think two things that I see, Shelby, please jump in if I forget anything. First, they try to put too much too many things into one learning objective. If learning object, try to think learning objective like a sentence, and you would have only one action verb in that sentence, and that will be it. And the second thing, whenever we ask why, again, we usually receive this answer: I would like them to understand. I would like them to know. So those are not really measurable action verbs. So understanding could be really, everything is subjective. I'm also talking to a humanist right now. Everything is subjective, of course, but if you actually have, for instance, describe da 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 da, it will be easier for you to actually identify an assessment or learning activity that you can provide meaningful feedback to your students. That could be a graded assignment, or that could be a formative assessment where you provide verbal or written feedback. So try to be very succinct with your objectives and try to use action verbs when you are describing or when you're answering the why question.
Yeah, I definitely fell into that trap of not being succinct. I remember some of the earlier drafts of objectives were like 5 different things. It's like, okay, well, this isn't working. And some of those got narrowed down. Some of those got broken up into multiple objectives. But yeah, keeping things, that was one of the, it's interesting to me because that's also one of the things I think is hardest to learn about research writing as well, right? That you got to like really focus in on an argument, right? And it's the same thing here where you really got to focus in on a specific objective and, you know, and then keep that in its own kind of space.
Yeah. Yeah, think about your experience writing your thesis. How frustrated you were when your major professor was like, okay, this is not quite right. Like, you need to narrow your point down. Like, no, I spent like hours or days writing these up, but you are not there quite.
I think that's a great question, Julian. I would agree with everything that Pinar and Daryl just said. And I would also just remind us, because I look at it from the idea of we know everything that we want to know in order to relay it onto the students about this particular idea or topic in this course. The students coming in, though, don't know that. And so we're kind of making assumptions if we start convoluting the water too much. If we have an objective that has too many key points included in it, or maybe is not as explicitly written or is not measurable, because then as a student, if I look at this, I'm saying, okay, you expect me to be able to compute derivatives. I understand what that means. I don't know how to do that. I need to build that skill, and I will learn that in this course. If you're telling me I need to understand derivatives, well, yeah, sure, I understand them. Do I really, though? Are you wanting me to compute? Is that how I demonstrate my understanding? Or you want me to write an essay on it or do a project on it? How am I going to demonstrate to you what understand means? And so that is a great question. I think I would definitely agree with what Pinar and Daryl just said of the more explicit you can make it and the more measurable. It not only helps you with designing your assessments and your assignments in the course, but it helps the student also realize what are the expectations that you're placing on me so I can help self-regulate myself toward meeting these expectations in the course.
That's great. So I had the benefit when I did this alignment exercise, and it's I'll share the template with people. Is that okay? Is it okay for me to share that? Awesome. So I'll post a Dropbox link about that. And the thing that I feel like I benefited from was having you all like go at me about things, right? And asking and you being the ones to ask that why question. Do you have any tricks, any ideas for how best for someone to do this on their own and not in a team kind of environment?
I think I would start with a post-it note. Just take one and then write why on top of it. And then after writing every sentence, just look at that. If you are satisfied with that answer after reading what you just wrote, I think you are on the right track. But if you have a chance, and I know every institution, every higher education institution has multiple instructional designers or learning designers that would actually be more than happy to help you with that process. Working alongside with an instructional designer or a colleague would give you a perspective which will be different from your own. Because as Shelby was saying, as experts in our field, subject matter experts, we know anything and everything for that particular topic. And whenever we design something, we would like to include anything and everything because they need to know everything. And I'm capable of transferring this knowledge, but that's not the point. Learning happens when you actually provide time and allocate that silent moments in time so that students reflect and then come back, tackle those ideas in their mind, experience some of those things in their daily lives. So it's not the coverage, but really how they can actually take that information that you're providing to them and create their own knowledge base based on their learned experiences.
I would agree with that. And I would also just add, the idea of walking through this alone, while it's possible, it's always nice to be able to brainstorm alongside somebody else. So whether that somebody is maybe a learning designer or an instructional designer or somebody out of your center for teaching, but even just a colleague that really also understands the content and might understand what you're trying to get at, but can maybe help you drive a more succinct way of explicitly stating that objective in a measurable way, because they can challenge you and say, okay, you're saying understanding here, but what do you mean by understanding here? What do you want the students to be able to do? What's your assignment going to be? Just having somebody brainstorm is a great idea, because asking yourself why, 100%, I'm that kind of person that will just justify something so I can move on to the next topic. But if I have somebody actually challenging me like Pinar often does, I realize I have to actually come up with a valid justification for her, because she won't stop harping on, but why?
So we have time for some more questions. We've got one from Eric. This is a good, tough question. From an AP course high school perspective, how can high school teachers create learning objectives that will help scaffold students to be successful in college? That's a really tough question.
That's a really tough question, but that's a good question.
Yeah.
I think for the learning objectives, I don't... Here, the issue would be the learning outcomes, really. I think there are so many things that we can do to actually integrate high school teachers into higher education standards or courses. Like what will be the objectives in those courses that students will be taking when they come to a college. Then by looking at those learning outcomes, hopefully someone will be helping those higher education institution instructors to write those learning outcomes in a meaningful way, then map back those to your course as a high school teacher, if that makes sense.
I'd agree. I think for clarification, what we're saying is the idea that it's the downstream effect here that makes the most impact in our immediate kind of work schedule. And so it's not the objectives as much as it is the outcomes, as Pinar said, but what we also want to do in the moment is orient students to understand what the purpose of the objective is and how that translates to what their expectations are within your own course. So beyond what Pinar just said, which is highly valuable, we need to look at the skills that universities are looking for students to have. If we're talking about math, many universities have an entrance exam that students can take, which will help determine, what kind of course they're going to be starting out as. Is it college algebra? Is it something above that? Is it something below that? And so we can use that to help use that backwards design to figure out what some of our more explicit outcomes and objectives are. But the other purpose of this is also to help students realize what our role as learners are in, okay, this is the expectation that you're laying forth for me, that you want me to be able to compute these ideas or whatever the case might be. But that I also realize how you're going to be measuring that. So I know as a student, and you're being transparent with me, how I can best proceed in learning this skill or knowledge. And then beyond that, how I'm going to successfully demonstrate that to you. So there's kind of twofold here, right? It's not only how do you write it for the sake of preparing them for university level content and work, but it's also helping them realize the expectations are more on them as students now, because a lot of students will come into college and they'll just expect things to be handed to them, and we're trying to make them more self-regulated as well. And so that's kind of maybe a secondary goal of all of this, is to allow them to see what good objectives are, so when they get to college and they're saying, I don't understand what you mean by understand here, Professor X, can you be more explicit about it? That can help kind of move this dialogue along as well.
And I think the other rule of thumb will be looking beyond and looking at the big picture. So formal education takes you to until a certain point. We all know that. We've been through that. But what do they need in their real lives to be successful? Really take a look at the job applications, expectations from those applicants. What type of skills your course particularly can actually give them so that they will be successful. And always be open and transparent to your students. Like, you are doing this in this course because in the future you will be able to get a job in this area, and this is how it relates. So just giving them that structure, that pathway, so that you're actually giving them a skill as opposed to just dumping the information onto them. So it will be actually very apparent and explicit to them. And they can also become self-learners, self-regulated learners, and it will be a life skill.
Yeah, that's great. Any other questions from our online viewers? Or any other things that that you two wanted to add from today?
I think maybe the second part of that document, where we have another table with the assessments and learning activities, where we walk our faculty through how to map particular learning assessments and learning activities to specific learning objectives.
Is this the assessment list and distribution by topic, that chart?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got mine up on the screen for people.
That's great. So it looks messy on Daryl's because it was very well cared. And it will look messy on yours as well, but it will help you make very intentional decisions about how you would like to assess your students and what kind of learning activities would be actually supporting their students to be successful in those big assignments in the course. Mm-hmm. Could be exams, could be big writing assignments.
Yeah.
This is where the whole idea of scaffolding that Daryl first alluded to at the beginning of today's conversation comes into play. Is in here, you might have an objective. So let's just say objective number 1 that you've highlighted as being an important objective for your course. And you might only have one particular element, if any, related assignments or assessments to that particular objective. And we might say, okay, well, is that appropriate? Do you need to scaffold the students in order to better prepare them to more effectively and appropriately write that essay? Maybe there's going to be some group work. Maybe there's going to be some peer feedback element. It helps you orient yourself not only to what's the best way to assess it, but how am I preparing students to succeed in that particular task that I will be asking them to give me a snapshot of their demonstrated skill or knowledge. And so that really highlights voids that you might have accidentally overlooked or just not given much consideration to.
And this is also the point where you start thinking about how you would like to chunk your content in your course. So just to maybe make our way to the next segment of the series, you will see when Daryl starts talking about his course structure in Canvas. Instead of assigning week 1, week 2, week 3, or deadlines for your modular structure, try to pick themes that would make sense and that will be relatable. Because in 3 years or in 2 years, I will not be able to remember week 1 and what kind of content we covered in week 1, but I would definitely remember the conversations that we had related to water metaphors, for instance. That was like one of the topics that Daryl covered in his course. I remember that, but I don't remember which week it was in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just gonna pull up real quick here on the. I know we're about to run out of time, but I just wanted to pull up my Safari to show you. Well, of course, I'm in the wrong semester. But just to see like what that looked like in Canvas, which we have branded as Icon at Iowa. But you can see kind of, so I broke my stuff down into these units that were really geared around kind of big topics, with then more kind of specific topics for each week. And one of the things, just to tease for next time, let's kind of show, I guess I'll just pick week 3, not for any particular reason. One of the things that I think the students really appreciated was that for each week we had, because of that chart that we just had up, you have the objectives that are being addressed in each, listed out for each week, as well as like good organization for, well, here's what you need to do before class, here's what you do in class, here's what you do after class, and doing that for each class day of the week. You make a template. It's not that hard to kind of keep up with it and to load them all in batches, but it makes a big difference for the students, and it helps to keep them focused on on these big picture things. We would do the same thing in with the assignments too, and I'll show one of those real quick. I'll mention and it looks like I've got 1 million assignments here, and I kind of do have 1 million assignments, but I'll talk about that more next time, since a lot of these are just these low risk formative assessments that really have a big impact in the end. So this is the assignment that students were didn't like before and then really liked after the revision, and I keep the part of this is having a clear learning goal that's laid out for them, and it would look better if I opened up the actual like PDF of the assignment sheet, which is this right here. Because here's where you see how even, at this level, then everything gets linked in with, okay, here are the course learning objectives that this assignment is dealing with. And, laying out what the expectations are in a clear kind of way, laying out what I expect to see in the assignment and tying all that back to those learning objectives and those action verbs. So I'll talk about that more next time. Well, we are definitely out of time. Thank you so much, Shelby and Pinar, for joining me, for being part of this discussion. You really have changed my perspective on teaching and learning, and I can't thank you enough for that. Next week, I'll talk about how I structure some of my assignments for in-person and remote learning, and kind of what some of the differences are between the two and the way that worked out for me in the spring, and then I'm planning to work it out in the coming semester. And we'll also look a little bit more at my Canvas page to show you how to keep things organized for yourself and for your students. Because if you can set yourself up like that from the beginning, it just makes a world of difference all throughout the semester. So again, thank you so much for being with me, Shelby and Pinar.
Thank you
Thank
all
you.
for having us, and Daryl for this invitation. And if we can help provide consultations to any of you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Daryl knows how to get a hold of us. We stalk him all the time. So please, if we can help and consult with you on anything, don't hesitate to let us know. But thank you for this opportunity.
Absolutely. It was such a pleasure, and it is pleasure to work with you and be partner in crime.
Well, thank you. And really, for anyone watching this from the University of Iowa, oh my gosh, you don't know what you're missing by not reaching out to these folks. And it really is like it's. I wish I'd met y'all, 5 years ago. So but it definitely changing my perspective moving forward. So thank you again. Thanks to all of you who tuned in, and anyone who tunes into the recording that will be on the Facebook page. So I'll put an event up for next week. Should be probably same time, same day. So I'll decide that in the next 24 hours or so. Take care. Thanks again. Bye, y'all.